Nothing aboard Lincoln is broken. Nothing has failed. And that is the most expensive sentence the Navy can write about a ship that has been at sea for more than 250 days, because it means nobody has to act. On paper, a nuclear carrier never has to come home. The reactors outlast the crew. The fuel arrives by cable. On paper, she can stay forever. Lincoln has been testing that since November, extended past the date her crew was given, and then extended again. And somewhere in the middle of it, a patrol turned into a war. The ship is still standing. Her crew is still standing. But some of what holds them there is not. She is spending her own future to stay where she is. Flight hours burned faster than planned. Maintenance pushed into someone else's schedule. 5,000 people absorbing every gap because no one is coming to fill them. And the bill does not arrive until she is gone. Every day the meter runs. No supply ship carries the thing that stops it. The only mechanism the fleet has ever built for resetting a deck is putting a different deck in the same water. 11 carriers on the books. Take away the ones opened up in a yard, the ones not yet qualified, the ones freshly home and owed everything they deferred. The number left fits on one hand. Then ask which ocean each of them is standing in, and the hand gets smaller still. The Navy has not said who. No order has been announced, and nothing that follows is a report of one. One hull fits every constraint. What follows is the argument for which one, built out of overhaul dates, flight hours, training cycles, and distances. All of it public, none of it waiting for anyone to make a statement. Start with the part that gets skipped. Why does a carrier have to be relieved at all? She is not going to run out of food. She is not going to run out of fuel. The reactors are built to run about 25 years before they need refueling, and the jet fuel her air wing burns comes alongside from a supply ship every few days, along with everything else that fits in a pallet. On paper, a nuclear carrier can stay at sea almost indefinitely. On paper. What actually runs down is everything that cannot be handed across on a cable at 12 knots. And in this case, something else happened first. The war changed the job without changing the ship. Before the 28th of February, the work was presence, patrols, transits, and exercise with a partner Navy. After it, the same deck was launching strike packages, escorting shipping through a closed strait, and standing air defense around the clock. The threat has not been theoretical either. At least one Iranian drone has been engaged on its way toward her. Every one of those changes lands on the same 5,000 people. Sortie rates went up. Maintenance demand went up behind them, because every hour flown is an hour owed. Readiness conditions went up, which means more stations manned at once, which means fewer people off watch at any given hour of the day. The one number that did not go up is the number of people aboard. A war does not send more sailors. Whoever walked up the brow in San Diego in November is who has been carrying it since February. Some of that is metal. Aircraft accumulate flight hours toward inspections no carrier can perform, and a shooting campaign accumulates them far faster than a patrol does. Ship maintenance is scheduled in blocks that need a pier and shore power, and every extra month at sea pushes that work into a slot the fleet had already promised to someone else. The rest of it is people. Enlistments end on their own schedule. Transfers, schools, and promotion boards come due, and none of them happen from the Arabian Sea. So every gap is absorbed by whoever is already standing there, holding two jobs instead of one. And a long deployment normally has one valve for all of it, a port call. 4 days somewhere to go ashore and stop being on the ship. With the strait closed and the region hostile, that valve has been shut for almost the whole deployment. None of that shows up as a failure. That is the point. A carrier on station does not break down. She quietly spends her own future to stay where she is, and the bill is presented later, to somebody else's deployment. Which is why relief is not a reward for a tired crew. It is the only mechanism the fleet has for stopping that meter. So the real question is not whether Lincoln gets relieved, it is which hull can do it. On paper, the Navy has 11 carriers on its books, and one of those is already on her farewell deployment. That is an inventory number, not an availability number. Several are in the yard, opened up. Several more are working up with crews not yet qualified to go anywhere. 1 or 2 are freshly home and owed every hour of maintenance they deferred to stay out. Take those away, and the number that could actually be somewhere, ready on short notice, is small enough to count on one hand. Then apply the second filter, which ocean each of them is already standing in, and the hand gets smaller still. Theodore Roosevelt is the name this argument arrives at. And the first reason is the least glamorous one. She is in the right ocean. She spent the summer leading Rim of the Pacific, the largest naval exercise in the world. 30 nations, more than 30 surface ships, over 200 aircraft, all of it run through her command spaces. That is a full workup cycle executed at scale, with a strike group that finished it together. She came back to San Diego in the first days of August with every certification current, and nothing yet spent. Compare that with the geography of the alternative. Eisenhower, the other name people raise, would have to cross the Atlantic and then either the canal or the long way around a continent before she started being useful. That is not a prediction about what the Navy will do. It is a distance problem. And distance is the one variable in this argument nobody gets to argue with. Now the ship herself, and here the numbers matter for a specific reason. 2 A4W reactors, 4 shafts, 4.5 acres of flight deck, roughly 100,000 tons. Those figures do not make Roosevelt special. They make her a Nimitz-class carrier, and they are the same on the ship she would relieve. What makes them worth stating is where each of them sits on its own meter. Every one of those systems came out of a maintenance period, went through a workup, and has not yet been asked to sustain anything. Her air wing reads as a chain rather than a roster. At the far end, the Liberty Bells fly the E-2D, whose radar sits high enough to see past the curve of the Earth. Behind them, the Rooks fly the Growler, whose business is the electromagnetic spectrum. Find the emitters on the far shore, characterize them, deny them. The Sidewinders now fly the F-35C, which puts a sensor where the others should not go. 4 strike fighter squadrons wait at the end of that chain to act on whatever the first 3 produce, the Black Knights among them flying the 2-seat Super Hornet, the airframe cleared for the longest-ranged air-to-air round in the inventory, which will matter shortly. Underneath all of it, 2 helicopter squadrons cover what happens under the water and on it, and a detachment of Ospreys keeps the logistics artery open. That is the least glamorous capability aboard, and the one that decides how long the rest of it keeps working. Every deployed carrier arrives with a version of that chain. One thing on this strike group has never gone to that theater before. Information Warfare Squadron 9 stood up aboard Roosevelt one day before the war opened, the first of its kind on the West Coast, and the second in a 4-year experiment the Navy is running to see whether the idea holds. Oceanography, fleet intelligence, cyber defense, and electronic warfare have always ridden along on a strike group as separate detachments reporting up separate chains. The squadron collapses them under one commander, structured the way an air wing is. The point is latency. Every non-kinetic decision used to travel down several parallel paths that had to be reconciled at the top, and reconciling takes time nobody logs. This reduces them to one path. In a fight that is largely an argument about who sees whom first, the length of that path is a weapon. There is one honest mark against her, and it belongs in the open. Roosevelt came out of her refueling overhaul in 2013. Lincoln came out of hers in 2017. A Nimitz-class hull gets exactly one of those in 50 years, and by that measure, the relieving ship is 4 years further along than the ship she would relieve. That is real. It is also the only column in this comparison where she loses, and 4 years of cycle position is a thing the Navy schedules and budgets for. It does not outweigh being ready in the right ocean with nothing spent, which covers the ship. It does not cover what she would be carrying. Since the end of February, campaign and blockade have been subtracting from Lincoln's magazine. Strike packages, escort missions, air defense engagements, every one of them comes off the count. She has been resupplied at sea many times over. Combat logistics forces exist for exactly that. What no replenishment ship can restore is the shape of what is left. Which rounds ran short first, and which ones the theater has learned to stop spending. Roosevelt would arrive with none of that history. And one round in particular is worth stopping on, because it does not make her air wing better at what everyone else does. It changes where the fight starts. The AIM-120 AMRAAM, in its longest-ranged variant, reaches somewhere around 86 nautical miles, past 100 if every launch condition falls the right way, which it will not. The AIM-174B, the round the fleet calls Gunslinger, is publicly confirmed at about 130, with reported estimates running past 250. Take the confirmed floor, throw out every estimate above it, and the conclusion still holds. That is not a better missile. That is the fence being moved. The AIM-174B is the Standard Missile-6, the fleet's own long-range interceptor, hung under an aircraft. 1,900 pounds, past 15 feet, a 140-pound blast fragmentation warhead in a different class from anything the AMRAAM family carries. Only the Super Hornet can take it up. The F-35C cannot. The round does not fit the internal bay, and hanging it outside would surrender the one thing that airframe exists to protect. Now the part that decides the range, because it is the most useful piece of physics in this whole argument. A standard missile leaving a destroyer's vertical cell starts at sea level with 0 velocity, and spends its own fuel buying altitude before it can spend any on distance. The same round under a Super Hornet's wing is handed both for free, released high, where the air is thin and drag is cheap, already carrying the speed of the aircraft that brought it. Same motor, same warhead, different reach. The difference lives entirely in the starting conditions. What that reach is for is not a duel between fighters. It is aimed at the eyes. Maritime patrol aircraft, airborne command and control, the machines that orbit hundreds of miles offshore and turn a fleet into a set of coordinates. Cut the eyes, and a coastal anti-ship battery still has its missiles and no longer has an address to send them to. And the shot comes from outside the arc of the batteries dug in along that coast. The part that closes the argument is not the missile. It is who has already flown with it. Roosevelt's Super Hornets carried the round in exercises off California in the weeks before the war opened, in a long-range maritime strike exercise that included an Air Force bomber from the middle of the continent, not a test squadron. Her squadrons, the ones that would go, trained with it and never yet spent it. One thing has to be said plainly because it is the honest cost of sending her. There is no separate factory for the air-launched round because there is no separate missile. The AIM-174B is an SM-6, the RIM-174 Standard missile that fills the Mark 41 cells of the Navy's destroyers and of the last 3 cruisers it still has in service, minus the booster stage it only needs when it has to leave from sea level. One of those 3 cruisers is Cho Sin, and as of this deployment cycle, she sails in Roosevelt's strike group. The same round would go out with that group twice over, under a Super Hornet's wing, and in the cells of the ship stationed to keep anything from reaching the carrier at all. One production line builds both, on the order of 125 rounds a year. The Navy has since signed agreements meant to push that toward 500, which is the clearest statement anyone has made about how thin 125 was. So every round that goes under a wing is a round that did not go into a cell. A deeper magazine in the Arabian Sea is a shallower one somewhere else. That is the price of the decision, not an argument against it. A round in a Mark 41 cell is doing serious work. It is the layer standing between a destroyer and whatever is inbound. Neither role wastes it. The only question is which ocean the shooting is in. A hull can be sailed. A magazine can be crated. The thing this last argument is about cannot be shipped at all. A watch has a length. That is the first thing anyone learns about time at sea. It is not a day, it is a block, and the block ends. 3 hours at a console, and then somebody else takes the seat. What follows sounds generous. 9 hours off. Written on a watch bill, it looks like more free time than anyone gets ashore. It is not free time. It is where the job lives. Maintenance, drills, qualification boards, meals eaten standing up. A watch is what a sailor stands. The hours between watches are what a sailor does. The Navy knows the arithmetic because it wrote the arithmetic down. A floor of 7 hours of sleep in 24, a working day capped at 12. Then it adds a clause, because a warship is not a factory. Except when required by operational tasks, everything since the 28th of February has been that clause. Every watch on Lincoln has been relieved thousands of times since November. Lincoln herself has not been relieved once. Look at what that deployment actually is. San Diego on the 21st of November on a normal deployment schedule. 1 port call at Guam in the middle of December. After that, nothing but the ship. The same passageways, the same ladders, the same faces at the same meals, in an order that stops being a schedule and turns into a kind of weather. Somewhere in the middle of it, they went past the mark for consecutive days at sea by an American carrier. That was noticed ashore more than it was noticed aboard, because aboard it changed nothing. The next watch still had to be stood, and nobody who packed a bag in November was packing for a war. They packed for a Pacific patrol. The order that changed the ocean reached them when they were already at sea, and the shooting started more than 3 months after they left the pier. A watch rotation carries an unwritten promise that somebody will arrive to take the seat. On this deployment, that promise has now been pushed back twice. Christmas at sea, New Year at sea, then spring, then summer, and no date yet on the season after that. all of it seen from the same 1,092 feet of steel. Fatigue this far into a deployment does not look like collapse. It looks like everything's still getting done, and taking a little longer to do. None of it has been ordered. None of what follows is a report of a decision. It is only where the argument points. So ask what Roosevelt's arrival would actually bring to that deck. Reach and rounds are things a ship carries. What it would bring the 5,000 people standing those watches is something no ship carries at all. The same relief they hand each other every 3 hours, finally scaled up to the size of the whole ship. It would begin as a second mast on the horizon. 2 crews in the same water for a few days. Then Lincoln would turn for home, and the cycle on that deck would belong to somebody else. To the people standing those watches, that mast would not be a strategic development. It would be the first sign that the weight was about to be carried by somebody else. And the crew coming the other way is not naive about what it would be sailing into. They have watched this deployment from the other side of the Pacific and finished a full workup cycle knowing exactly which ocean it was for. Every qualification current, every damage control team newly certified, every division at full manning instead of covered by people carrying somebody else's job on top of their own. They are as good as the crew they would relieve, held to the same standard. They are not fresh by accident, they are fresh on purpose, and they volunteered knowing where that workup was pointing. At the scale of 3 hours, somebody always arrives to take the seat. At the scale of a whole ship in a war, it happens when the fleet can arrange it, and not before. Whenever that is, Lincoln's crew would hand over what they know, walk up the brow, and stop, and the promise they have kept for every watch they have stood since November would finally be kept back to them. Put the 3 together, and the argument stops being about 2 ships. A carrier is a weapon that has to be somewhere. Not deployed in general, somewhere specific, continuously, or it may as well not exist. And the moment it is somewhere specific, it starts consuming the thing that lets it be there. Flight hours, maintenance blocks, certifications, people. It buys presence with its own future, at a rate nobody can slow down. Which is why the fleet cannot solve this by trying harder. There is no version of endurance that stops the meter. Resupply extends the deployment and accelerates the bill. The only mechanism the Navy has ever built for genuinely resetting a deck is putting a different deck in the same water. And that mechanism has exactly one requirement. Another ship, ready, close enough to matter. Which means most of this was settled before the first shot was fired. A yard period booked years in advance. A workup cycle scheduled around it. An exercise that happened to put one strike group through its paces in the ocean next door, at the right point in its own calendar. None of that was arranged with Iran in mind. It is simply what the schedule left on the table. Fleets do not really choose their reliefs. They discover which choice, their own calendar already made for them. That is the whole case, and it is worth being clear about what kind of case it is. Nothing here came from inside a decision. It came from overhaul dates, exercise calendars, squadron stand-ups, and days at sea. All of it published, none of it secret. The fleet is reading the same numbers. It simply gets to act on them, and the numbers point one direction. Lincoln is spending a future she will have to repay in a yard. Roosevelt has spent nothing, sits in the right ocean, brings a squadron that theater has never had, and flies an air wing already trained on the longest round in the inventory. If the argument is wrong, it will be wrong for a reason that is not on any of those lists. Go back to the first sentence. Nothing aboard Lincoln is broken, and that is still the most expensive truth of this deployment. Being in the water before anyone needs you in it is the entire job, and it is also why relief is not optional. Presence is not a posture a fleet can simply hold. It is a thing that gets consumed while it is being provided, and the only way to keep providing it is to keep replacing the thing providing it. Lincoln has been paying for that station out of her own hull, her own aircraft, and her own people since before the first shot. Somewhere on the other side of the Pacific, if this argument holds, sits a ship that is paid for nothing yet. The fleet does not need a better carrier, it needs a full one.